Welcome to the station, Kentucky's conservative outpost. And if you've watched this show for the past few weeks, you know that we've seen that we've talked about the midterm elections quite a bit. I mean, that was, if you're, this is a political show. It deals with political commentary, and so politics is based around elections. So there was a big election, so we talked a lot about all those elections and all those races. And so we're through that election. Boy, what an interesting cycle. There was a lot going on there, both nationally, locally, so many new dynamics at play, lots of wins, lots of disappointments for both sides, and we're going to take this show and just unpack what just happened in this midterm, because it needs some context, because what we were told didn't necessarily play out, and for lots of reasons. This red wave that we were all told that was rolling in didn't quite make it. It crashed on the rocks, and maybe the rocks of Jefferson County. Who knows? We'll see. So first of all, I'm going to introduce my guest. Now we have Jim Waters again with the Bluegrass Institute. Jim is amazing. Great thoughts on everything. And then Josh Crawford with the Georgia Center for Opportunity. So George, and thanks for coming back. And you're now with a new think tank but you're still based in Louisville. But that's
correct. That's
great. We're excited to have you here. And so guys, we really went through an interesting cycle here. And I think one of the big issues that both parties are starting to come to grips with is how you run an election. How do you, how people are now voting, the new voting patterns based on not just demographics and its traditional voting patterns, but just how do you frame a race now when you have early voting or you have mail-in balloting, and it seems that you've got one party, the Democratic Party, that has really adopted and embraced this new method of voting, and because they're traditionally been more a party that wants to expand the voting franchise, make it easier for people to vote, make it forget voter IDs. Let's make it a 5-month window where you can vote, and maybe there's some merits to that, but there's also some downsides. The Republicans are coming along saying, well, that makes it pretty easy to cheat. You got 5 months to count ballots, and you can go out and do voter harvesting and all this craziness, and we're not into that. So we're not going to encourage that sort of approach in this election cycle. Well, that may have played, those two different viewpoints probably played a huge role in the outcome, because I think you had one party that really embraced it, learned how to ramp up the vote totals for their side using new methods. May they be legal or illegal, who knows? We'll find that out. But they ramped up the totals for their side, and the Republicans, they were just driving out voters for Election Day and hoping that would make the difference. And in many races, it did not, it seems. So so let's talk about that nationally, just in a general trend, but also how Kentucky dealt with that. I mean, how those dynamics played out in this state. And so Josh, what do you think early voting and ballot harvesting made a difference in any race nationally, or?
Yeah, I think the first and perhaps most important point to make is that I think that the primary reason that the so-called red wave did not materialize the way people predicted was because very early in the night, Ron DeSantis and the other conservatives in Florida took it all for themselves and chose to just run up the score so much.
That's
in Florida.
Right. That's right. They absorbed it all. Yeah.
I think that this is sort of really the first post-COVID election that we've had, but also under a lot of these new schemes and rules. Kentucky has made some changes, and to use the terminology that Secretary of State Adams uses so frequently, has made it easier to vote and harder to cheat. And I think that innovations and changes like that are positive. We want people engaged civically. We want people engaged with their government through the process of voting. But we want to make sure that the people who are casting those ballots are in fact who they say they are, and things like that. I've not seen any particular evidence that there were particularized frauds or anything like that took place around the country. But I do think Republicans kind of playing catch up as it relates to voter turnout in that system absolutely does matter, right? Republicans still tend to be of the belief that you vote on Election Day, so to speak, and there's some positives to that. But if that's all you're doing, then your ground game is inadequate compared to your opponents. And so
That's
I
right.
think being sort of behind on that front absolutely mattered.
Yeah, it sure did, Jim.
I think Republicans need to see this as an opportunity to expand their demographic reach, to understand young people, like this voting, this difference. They like having a choice. They like being able to vote early.
Right.
And so, maybe thinking of it in terms of, of the opportunity that's there to grow, to maybe grow some of their support in areas in groups that they hadn't had before would be a way to approach this. Secretary Adams, we had him on the Bluegrass Institute. We did an online event with him, and he talked about, how that actually extending the number of days to vote is not a new idea. This was done in the early part of our country because of you had to be able to get to your county seat or wherever you were voting legally. And Kentucky has lots of bodies of water, of all things, and the people had to be able to get across bridges.
Right.
And this is actually
I
true
can believe that.
history.
Yeah, that's right.
But what happened was that it was actually some of the big urban interests. We always have special interests that are trying to push and pull things in their direction. But a lot of urban interests wanted to end that, and so the 1 day voting was actually a lot of that going on. That we don't want the rural folks having a chance to more than 1 day to vote. So it can be done. It can be done fairly, and it can be done cleanly. I have no evidence that in Kentucky we haven't done a great job. In fact, Secretary Adams has gone out into other states and tried to help them with their election processes. So I think we need to it's here to stay. I think we're going to see that happen. And, our society, people are all about choices, and I think that can be good. Certainly there can be issues. There have always been issues in elections. We can talk about that. But I think what's fascinating to me is how you can have a state like Florida that can count their votes in 5 hours, and we're still waiting on Arizona and some in Georgia or whatever to count theirs. So, that what they need to do is get their act together and learn how to count these votes on time and on election day.
Yeah, what good are these computers and machines if they can't tally up a vote quickly?
Exactly.
It's like you might as well go back to hand counting at that point. But election fraud is, I don't think we have a lot of election fraud in this state, but we probably do have some practices such as ballot harvesting and is that illegal in our state? Can you go to a nursing home and walk through each room and say, "Hi, I'm your local neighborhood representative of the Democratic Party, and I happen to have a ballot right here, and would you like to vote today? And I'll turn it in for you." Is that legal in this state? Can that happen?
Well,
To my knowledge, it is not.
It's not happen. I don't think. I don't. It's not. It's not legal here.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
I mean, I'm
That's
not
good.
an expert on elections,
Right.
but
I'm not saying it has happened, but I'm really curious.
But I don't think
the
it's
rules are.
legal. I've actually heard some Republican pundits say that that the Republicans should do some of that.
Absolutely.
And I think if you can't win on your ideas and you can't win on your policies and you can't win on your character in your campaign, then I think we want to have clean, fair elections.
Absolutely.
No matter what the outcomes
rules allow
are.
for
Exactly.
you to go out and show up at a local church function, for example, and say, okay, today we're having a special guest today. It's so and so from the so and so party, and he's going to talk about how you can vote, and we can vote right now. Everybody line up and we'll vote. I think you're going to see that if the Democrats can pursue that with their elections, then you're going to see a response and on the right. And so,
well, and let me say, I know there are people who have different opinions on this, even in our state. I mean, I know there are concerns about ballot counting and machines in particular, whether the machines are, whether they're doing the right things or not. So I'm always for transparency, openness, for accountability, for putting protection in place for voters. I mean, I think our votes are important. People have died and paid a great price for us to be able to go vote. And so I think it's prudent for us to continue to, just because we had a good election this time, I mean, I think we have to continue to make sure in Kentucky and around the nation, that we have free and fair elections. So, but I mean, you can go back in history and read, like in Chicago, where in different big cities in particular, I think, where there was definitely problems with the ballots and voting. So but to the extent that we can prevent that, I think we should. So
by most metrics from a historical standpoint, things have gotten better in this regard than like they have for most things, right? In early America, like first decade America, it was not uncommon to have sort of roving mobs as political parties that would literally squash opposition, as opposed to just sort of via social media squash opposition kind of thing. And so by most metrics, we're actually headed in the right direction. And I think that most of these innovations are in and of themselves sort of value neutral, right? That you can expand the number of days that somebody is eligible to vote, that citizens are eligible to vote, and it can be a really positive thing or it can be a really negative thing depending on how you structure those processes, right? And that's why I think those sort of simultaneous harder to cheat, easier to vote things are important. And I think traditionally, I think this point was already made, that Democrats have always been interested in making it easier to vote. Republicans have always been interested in making it harder to cheat, but perhaps this is an area where there's some compromise to be had, and that's essentially what happened here. I mean, those voter reforms were championed by Secretary of State Adams, passed with large bipartisan majorities in both chambers, and I think when done properly will be really good for the state and won't particularly benefit any political party.
So we're doing a decent job in the state, but I still think there's a strong case to be made. Let's go back to Election Day. Let's go back to Election Day. Let's get rid of these machines, and let's just go back to paper. And here's the problem. If we don't have confidence in our elections, and we're starting to lose that nationwide, and this great we do a good job in the state. I'm proud of it. But if we lose confidence in our elections, then that's a real sign that we're moving towards a dysfunction in our polity that's not healthy.
Are we losing confidence in elections because people are losing confidence in elections, though, or because people have made it the entirety of their campaign for national office that elections aren't fair, right? Like,
and
I think there's a bit
of
a chicken and an egg problem there, right? That I think that a lot of that erosion of confidence stems from one individual in particular going out to deliberately erode that confidence, right? I think in the absence of that, you would still have some of it, and you would have particularized cases, right? This is not to say that voter fraud is never a problem, and there aren't particular jurisdictions where it's perhaps a huge problem. But I think nationwide, it is not the issue that it has been made to be on a grand scale. Again, particularized examples, absolutely, but not in a grand sense.
I would take issue on a couple levels. I think there's been some real strong attention and research done on the topic in the past few years. And granted, it's very partisan, obviously, but a lot of these are media outlets that are doing this stuff. And I'll bring up a documentary that's pretty popular in conservative circles. Was it 200 Mules or whatever that is, the Dinesh D'Souza documentary where he talks about people ballot harvesting, and the theory is that there's these nonprofits that are very left wing that are either printing ballots or harvesting ballots and giving these ballots to mules that quote unquote drop these things off to various drop boxes, voter drop boxes, which thankfully we don't have in this state, but in Georgia they have a lot of, and there's a lot of evidence that there was some real questionable things going on there, and I don't discount that there could have been, and so because I think where there's power, there's an interest to get that power, and if there's a certain ideology and an element of our polity that thinks that that power is the most important thing, forget about the system, we just want power, then they're going to do that. There's nothing wrong with them doing that in their mind. And so I don't think that we have this system anymore. We have both parties and both sides want to maintain the system. I don't think we're not there anymore. I think one side does, and the other side just wants power. And so cheating is just, hey, if Donald Trump's a Nazi, if he's Hitler, what would you do to get rid of Hitler? So there's people that really think this way, and so
you're right. I should ballot harvest for DeSantis in the primary.
Absolutely, I'm with you. I'll be the mule.
Well, I do think with the attention being paid to it, that's actually a positive to reducing
Absolutely.
the possibility of some of that happening, because there is so much attention paid to it. So, and I think they may have had an area in Lexington where you could drop off ballots. I think there was, but there was all kinds of cameras there, and I mean, it was just like if anybody tried to get by with anything, it was. I mean, that was probably one of the most looked at places
right.
in the universe, of Kentucky.
Oh, yeah.
So I think a bigger problem is how how the states actually their election processes and policies. And Josh made a great point about, Secretary Adams really handled this well. I give him a lot of credit. He came to the legislature. He worked hard to get a good bill passed in policy, and we're seeing the results of that. Good consequences from good policy. And other states, I think that's where a bigger problem is. I think you invite issues, questioning of election integrity when it takes days and days and days to vote. I think it's hard but if you get it done, I think there's a lot less of that.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. Well said.
And I will say, I voted on paper. I filled out a paper ballot when I voted. I mean, this time, and I did vote on election day. But I'm all for. I had a lot of people in my family who voted other days because they weren't going to be in town or whatever. Right. So I think 3 days. It's like Secretary Adams. I think he made the point. 3 days is not 3 months. 3 days. Having our 3-day early, we had Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and then Tuesday. I think my view is that's totally reasonable in our society.
Right.
I think it works.
Right. So. Well said. Well, that issue is definitely in play, and I think both parties are trying to recalibrate how they run elections or how they run their campaigns, and so this next 2024 is going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. Well, let's talk about the
one
races.
other thing on that, Tom, is the turnout. I think the turnout was solid this time. There was a good turnout. It wasn't a record turnout, but compared to midterms, I think it was on par with some of our better recent turnouts. I know 2018, I think it was on par with that. So that's actually a good sign for us who care about civic engagement. And midterms had gotten to the point where they were pretty low turnout, and so I think some of the drama and controversy actually caused people to say, "Hey, it really does matter that I should turn out vote." So that's just one perspective. That's my perspective.
Participation is good in some level, even though it's very hyper partisan. At least we're participating. So, well, very good. Well, let's talk about the races that we just witnessed and the results. So we've talked probably more about the mayor's race than any other race in the past few weeks. So what happened there? We had two pretty good candidates here. Bill Dourif was a wonderful mayor of J-Town, and of course lost his bid, but not by much. He did a pretty, I think, strong showing considering the balance of registered Democrats versus Republicans in this county. So I think he made a pretty good showing. Craig Greenberg won, and so what happened in that race? What's your opinion, Josh?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. One, the city of Louisville has gradually gotten bluer in recent years, just as a matter of makeup of the residents and things like that. So that obviously is in favor of whomever the Democrat nominee is. You saw that the East End has gotten much, much bluer, especially in certain parts around St. Matthews and not quite sort of far East End towards Oldham County. You saw that the southern part of Jefferson County has gotten quite a bit redder, and that played out in a number of state rep races down there and Metro Council seats down there. But overall, the direction of the county is blue, and I think contrasting Craig Greenberg with a number of the nominees and mayors of other large cities across the country, he really sort of stylized himself as a moderate. He talked a lot about crime. He talked a lot about issues other than just the sort of social issues that dominated Democrat campaigns this past election cycle. He talked about those issues too, but I think he appealed to more middle-of-the-road voters than some of the other Democrat nominees around the country. And so I think you put all that together, a really positive environment for Democrats overall within Jefferson County. A number of issues that drove Democrats to the polls, including Amendment 2 to the Constitution on the ballot.
Yeah, the abortion amendment.
Correct.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And then you have the makings of a Democrat election.
Okay. All right. So you had somewhat moderate Democrat who is pretty palatable to your average voter.
Yeah.
And so that didn't turn people away.
Right.
So that was a strength in his column. And then of course Amendment 2. So what about Amendment 2 caused the vote to move his direction? I mean, that,
Yeah.
how do you play? What's the relation?
Yeah, so Amendment 2 allowed a place for pro-choice voters to directly sort of express their opinion without having to endorse the other positions of a candidate, right? There are still in this country a number of very pro-life Democrats who are liberal on many other issues, and there is, especially among suburban voters and especially suburban women, who are sort of center-right on fiscal policy and some social issues like crime, a very strong pro-choice streak as well. So those voters who would perhaps otherwise be focused on kitchen table issues, the economy, crime, things like that, quality of life, were able to have the abortion issue right in the forefront of not just their ballot, but of their mind, right? And so does that voter go in and cast a vote for a Republican, or if they're thinking about Amendment 2, do they cast a vote for a Democrat? And I think the way that played out, again, especially in some of the East End precincts, was that it resulted in casting a vote for a Democrat.
So it motivated Democratic voters to come out and vote Democrat.
Right.
And Craig Greenberg was a Democrat. So that makes sense. Jim, what are your
and
thoughts
that
on that race?
affected a lot of races, I think.
did.
You know, it did, and I agree. I think that's exactly what happened. And
However, there were a lot of strong Republican. We'll get to these races later, but there's a lot of state reps that switched to the Republican Party in Jefferson County.
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah,
so
exactly.
that
So,
was
there was, I think, you know, and to Josh's point about Louisville turning bluer, I think a lot of parts of it are, you know, but I think a Republic, you know, Greenberg did the right things in terms of he played to his base during the primary, and then he played to the more the middle during the general election. And so, you know, but I think a Republican can win here. I think it can happen, and it may be that. But I think the abortion amendment did, and it may have been enough to give him. It may have been enough to give him Greenberg. I mean, in this city, not everywhere.
Right.
Not everywhere. That wouldn't have happened everywhere. But
the margin of victory was what, 4 points? I think it was like 52-48 or something, 52-47. It was pretty close.
Yeah. So I don't know if it would have been enough on that, but if you sort of think about it in terms of not so myopic, but that was definitely an issue that got people to the polls, and then maybe some other things mixed in there, you know, some other factors, you know. But I think I do think that had a big impact on these races. And in a city like Louisville, you know, you're surrounded here by red. Yeah. But in a city like Louisville, that was a great point that this was an opportunity for people to come out and express who are pro-choice, who to come out and express that without having to get into the messiness of all the views of a particular candidate, where they may agree with some but not others, and particularly suburban women. I think that would definitely be an issue there.
Wow.
So
there's been a case to be made that maybe the pro-life forces in this state may have made a mistake by putting that on the ballot this cycle, or maybe putting it on the ballot at all. You know, why do an amendment when you can just pass the law and with the control of the House and Senate, then it should pass and stay legal.
Well, we saw a similar thing happen in Kansas, right? Deep red state.
And it was much closer here than it was in Kansas. I mean, Kansas was a huge margin.
Yeah. Really? So, and Peggy Noonan, who's a national columnist with the Wall Street Journal, I thought wrote an insightful column about what happened in Kansas on that. That, you know, it's good to be passionate about what you believe in, and I think that's great. You know, I believe in that. But if you're trying to win a ballot issue I think you need to be careful about the rhetoric, and you need to invite people into your camp. You need to persuade people. I think winning hearts and minds, and I know that might sound out of place in today's partisanship, but on the constitutional amendment issue, I don't think it is. I think Wright could have done a better job, honestly, of winning hearts and minds, because they had stories to tell. They had good, positive things to say. But instead, I think too many times they chose to go the negative, double down on the inflammatory rhetoric. Both sides did.
Well, both sides did. I mean,
I'm not blaming, but what I'm saying,
listen, the left did more of that. I'm sorry.
No, they did. But what I'm saying is,
they're going to ban abortion.
If you want to,
no, it wasn't a banning abortion. It was just saying it didn't.
But on the other hand, if you want to reach the people who are turned off by that, you have to be different. You have to be different.
Well, there's already an uphill fight trying to get a constitutional amendment changed.
And exactly.
Anyway. That's it's hard to get any kind of constitutional amendment changed. Amendment 1 was a mess, complete mess. They had printed the whole paragraph, and people were like, I'm just going to vote no because I don't want to read.
Well, a word about that, though. The people who, even those who did understand, I think at the end of the day, that amendment was a statement about Governor Andy Beshear's overreach.
And I wish it would have
COVID.
passed. Yeah, exactly.
But I think people weighed that out, though. Here's the thing: is if we give legislators 12 more days in Frankfurt, they can meet. They're going to become a year-round legislature.
True.
And I think there's a lot of angst about that.
That's a good point.
Because we have this odd session coming up where it's not a budget session, but in the past several sessions, we've seen some real shenanigans with special favors. We saw this West Louisville TIF project pass during an odd year.
Yeah.
We've seen the Sealback Hotel giveaway. We've seen real problems, the Jewish hospital. All that happened in odd years.
Yeah, the less time our politicians have to meet and pass bills, the better off the public is typically. So
Very rarely is the exclusive content of a ballot initiative or an amendment in our case going to be what people are voting for when they're voting on that amendment, right?
Yeah.
Amendment 2, for example, takes place in the context of laws that the General Assembly has passed, takes place within the context of the Supreme Court overruling Roe, and so perhaps things would be different 5 years ago, would be different 5 years from now. But I knew very few people who voted for or against Amendment 2 who did so because of the exact contents of Amendment 2. They did it because they were generally pro-life and liked what the legislature had been doing, or they did it because they were generally opposed to the legislature and what they had been doing, but very little of it had to do with the actual nature of the Kentucky Constitution. And I think that's true for most issues. And I think the default position of the people of Kentucky as it relates to amendments is no anyway. It's just no to begin with.
Yeah, that's right.
And so
it takes a lot to change anything.
Which I'm glad of that.
Right,
We don't
yeah.
want
Right.
the Constitution has worked really well for
That's right.
a long time.
even our state
And
constitution.
I had people say, "Well, I think we should do it as a symbolic measure. We shouldn't change the Constitution
Right,
for
yeah.
symbolic
Well,
measures."
What's
No.
the future of the pro-life cause in this state? I mean, so that went down, but there's still a law on the books that prevents abortion and clinics to operate, and of course there's an injunction I think that's still being ruled on, and so what's the future right now? I know this isn't your policy specialty, but what do you think is going to occur with this issue in the state?
I think the honest answer to that is that it's somewhat unclear because it's tied up in the courts, right? And how the courts react to that legislation will matter some. And obviously it's in state court now because of change in federal precedent. And so we really have no idea how the state courts are going
That's
to
why we
handle
needed
this.
his amendment too,
Right.
to make sure
Because
that
it would answer that question,
That's exactly right.
right.
Circular argument.
But so the other side of that coin, though, is Kentucky's trigger law, for example, does not currently include an exception for rape. And one of the things that I think was a large part of the conversation around Amendment 2 is a conversation that's going on nationally right now is states that are having trigger laws that are unpopular don't have exceptions for rape.
Right.
And so to what extent is that revisited? But I think we're in an environment now where you're going to largely be talking about tweaking as opposed to large changes one way or the other.
Well, if our legislature has a say in it, I feel like we're going to have pro-life laws going forward. But
Right.
it's just will the courts interfere with that? And,
Right.
And so that remains to be seen. So,
I think we're going to have a largely pro-life state here for
Yeah.
the near and far future,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, you still can hold people accountable at the ballot box, you
Right.
know, and that still matters,
So
you
matters.
know.
Well,
So-
let's do this. Let's take a break, and we'll be right back. We want to talk about the school board races, the Senate races, and the governor's race next year. This is a big race coming up. We need to figure out how that's going to play out, and then and also just did the on the national level, did Trump have a positive or negative impact on campaigns? Is the establishment on its way out, or is it on its way in? Let's discuss that. You're watching the station. Welcome back to the station, Kentucky's conservative outpost, the only television show in the state where you can talk news and politics from a somewhat conservative perspective, a right-of-center perspective, and we're very proud to offer that to viewers who want to engage. And so I'm going to take my Pellegrino off the table. I'm not advertising for them tonight. I'm just enjoying them, but you know.
You know,
Okay.
they used to do that. They used to set
right,
things
yeah,
up there on the props on the.
That's exactly right. Just, what do we call that? The in-show content. Okay. All right. Let's talk about the races. We just went through a midterm that was pretty eventful, and it didn't go the way a lot of people thought or hoped. And we were talking about the mayor's race in the last segment. Let's talk about a few more races that we followed quite a bit on this show. One was the school board race, and of course around the country. Education and who runs your school boards is a huge issue. It's very top of mind. You know, a lot of the social issues, such as the LGBT agenda, the gender issues, trans issues are just have a lot of people concerned about how school systems are teaching their young people, and so that played out in various ways in various areas. So in Louisville, we had 4 of the 7 school board race seats up for election, and we had 4 really good challengers going against 4 established incumbents, and none of the challengers made it, and which in my mind is a little disappointing, but I think there's some reasons behind that. So, Jim, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think this is over. I think this was the beginning of some changes in the school board here. And sometimes these types of changes take more than one election cycle. I think, for a long time, those seats had not really been challenged by, or if they had, they weren't really serious or qualified candidates. And I think this time we saw that. There were actually 13 candidates for those seats. Now, the 4 that ran that you mentioned were a slate of really qualified, I think would have done a great job and may still come back around the next time, But this is a huge undertaking to challenge it. If you think challenging an incumbent legislator is tough, I mean, in our state, challenging a school board member is maybe even,
absolutely.
You're asking for it. Yeah. So what I liked about this, though, is the candidates that stepped up and the quality of them. And I think, I don't think, again, that we've seen the end of this. I think this is the beginning of some changes. And, the state legislature has made some important changes that have re-empowered school boards in recent years. In fact, we were just talking about a change with about the curriculum, that now not only will superintendents, and of course they answer to the boards who hire them, that we've re-empowered superintendents and boards with the say on these critical areas of curriculum, of personnel, of those issues, of finances, those issues. So, before we were holding school board members accountable, but we weren't giving them the authority to do this. So now the Jefferson County School Board's actually going to have to make some of these decisions that they were able to hide behind other people in the past. I think that's going to reveal some real issues there, and it's going to give some challengers in the future a chance to step up and run. But by re-empowering boards, I think we've reset. There's going to be a reset on that.
That's right.
And I think that's really important and I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic, actually. The more I thought about this, Charlie Bell, who we had here, was great. She talked about safety in the schools. She brought a different perspective on some issues about teacher retention and how it's not just about pay. We're paying teachers in Jefferson County the most in the state. The highest pay, some of the highest pay is here. So it was about other issues. So I think people sometimes need to hear that more than one election cycle.
That's true.
And then they need to respond.
You're right. We had really good candidates, challengers, and I expect to see more from them in the future. And the issues that they're running on are not going away because the incumbents aren't really the party of change there, and as it relates to those issues. So if those issues are still a concern to the voter, I think they're going to grow.
Well, I
and
think too, school choice is going to become more of a part of these candidates. It's already more than it ever was, but I'm optimistic about the direction we're going to go. I think that we're going to see more support as parents, and also we have this whole new group of legislators coming in, and I think educating and informing them on what choices really mean, what that means for parents, educational opportunities. I still think there's a learning curve to climb there on that. So,
that's right. Josh, what do you think? Do we have a chance to get a new school board in the next decade or so? Or are we going to?
I think that learning curve point is key, right? We talked a little bit earlier about Republicans kind of being behind the eight ball some on the new way of voting with multiple days and some of those things. I think that that's even more true as it relates to these school board elections, right?
Local elections, smaller elections.
There's a very straightforward status quo path to the Jefferson County School Board and most large city school boards in which those individuals are elected, not appointed, right? If you want to exist outside of that standard system, then you really kind of have to invent a new way, right? And to be frank, the only time that sort of anti-establishment or candidates who did not go through the sort of JCTA pipeline to get to the board has been the result of really well-funded campaigns here in Jefferson County. And so perhaps that's the path and it's just a money question, or perhaps there is some sort of new way that needs to be invented to get folks across the finish line. But I think to Jim's point, this was sort of that first step for folks. And if there is going to be a change in the ideological makeup of the Jefferson County School Board, it's going to have to be because there's been innovation in how those races are won.
Right.
Yeah, I do think the JCTA, the local union, which has a collective bargaining agreement here, so it empowers them, to be to sort of hold sway and leverage over potential candidates.
Yeah, people that may not understand that dynamic, but there are government employee unions out there that represent government employees, right? Well, they can support candidates to run for office. Well, those candidates very often are then beholden to those unions, and those candidates are have power to affect how those bargaining issues are worked out, and so it's a really it's not a good system. Matter of fact, it's so bad that even FDR didn't. He outlawed government unions for federal employees, but we still have that in the state level, local level. And
one of the things we're trying to do on that, one of the policy changes that we would like to see is where members of the teachers union, whether it's the state level or local level, have to opt into the union. They have to give written specific approval that they want dues taken out of their checks. Which right now union dues are automatically removed, and the union has a lot of power.
That's right.
But we don't think it's appropriate for government employers to give that, to be directly giving that money. So we want to put some slowdowns in there. We want to make it more difficult, and by attacking the pipeline of the unions and their resources, that will also help. It won't solve everything, but it will give. But a lot of teachers think they have to join the union to get certain services. But you can get liability protection. You can get some teachers just join, for that reason. But you can get that. Malpractice, insurance type stuff. You can get that.
Other methods.
Yeah, there are other organizations that are not unions that you can get that from.
Yeah, so. Well, there's hope. This is just the first battle of many that you're going to see for education, and people. This is a very important issue to people because it deals with their kids, and this is our future, and so this is you will not see the end of these. The candidates that challenge our incumbents here. So let's go to the next race, the Senate race. We had Rand Paul win, and of course it's probably an easy conversation. The state's pretty red, and he's a great senator, and he's done a good job. We're very, very popular, and so he won. So what else is there? Anything else to say about that? Or
I would just say Charles Booker said that he was going to shock the world, and I think it was barely register as an electoral trimmer, said my
Yes.
colleague Andrew McNeil at the Bluegrass Institute. So,
There we go.
but I think again, the over-the-top, some of his early advertising in particular, we talked about on election night.
Yeah,
was,
the advertisements. With the,
I just
with the
Kentuckians
news. Yeah.
in general. When you run a U.S. Senate race, that's a lot different than running a Louisville race. You know, you have to win over. You
That's
have to
right.
be a center right.
That's right, yeah.
I think you have to be a center right candidate to win
In this state. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I think
So-
Senator Paul also has been willing to stand up to some of the excesses of government and spending, and I think people here respect him. They might not always agree with all his views, but he did what he said. He's gone to Washington. He's done what he said he was going to do, and I, agree or not, that I think that's brings credibility to him. It speaks of his character.
I think it also, I think one of the major takeaways is just how big the margin was, right? Early in the night when you're looking at his victory, you're looking at DeSantis's victory in Florida, you're looking at some of these races and you're like, wow, Republicans are crushing their opponents. I mean, his margin would be the kind of margin you would expect in a wave election. And then it became very clear that a wave was not materializing across the country, but there were waves for individual candidates. And I think one of the big takeaways was if you have a solid right of center sort of conservative record, you're interested in governance, you're governing well, then the voters rewarded you. And after that, it got a lot more complicated. But
Right. Well, let's talk about that. So that there's a national, dynamic to this, and you've got two forces playing itself out in the Republican Party. You have the populist Trump wing of the party, and of course his support was behind many of these candidates that won and lost, and then you have the establishment that represented by our own Mitch McConnell. God bless him. I love the man. Doing great work throughout his tenure, but he's a pretty controversial figure in the party right now, and he did some controversial things in Alaska specifically. He supported, put a lot of money up there when we could have put money in other races that would have made more of an impact. At least that's one theory. So
to that point, really quick though, there is not a race where the Senate Leadership Fund did not put money or did not put substantial money that was particularly close on election night, right? What was clear was that the money needed to be in Wisconsin, where they ran ads for Ron Johnson, who just sort of eked it out. It needed to be in Ohio, where J.D. Vance was able to win pretty comfortably, but far underperformed Tom DeWine, the incumbent governor. Ted Budd in North Carolina was another race that was close, that they invested a tremendous amount of money. And they invested a tremendous amount in Pennsylvania, where things were close, and Georgia, where things were close. But Arizona and New Hampshire are the two races that are often pointed to, and neither of them were particularly close. And I mean, $13, $14, $15 million from the Senate Leadership Fund wouldn't have changed that.
Well, did Trump, did his endorsement make any difference in any of these races, or did it hurt? I mean, did the whole, MAGA sort of, populist right message, resonate in this election cycle, or did it not? And so,
I think that's actually two separate questions, right? Does a populist, somewhat nationalistic message resonate? I think the answer is, especially in certain parts of the country, the answer is more yes. But I think that Trump as the individual is somewhat becoming separated from the policy specifics, right? The Trump endorsement becomes about Donald Trump, not necessarily a set of policy prescriptions. And so there was an analysis done of this, and Trump-endorsed candidates underperformed non-Trump endorsed candidates in the same type of environments. And again, I don't think that's because of policy specifics necessarily, but it has more to do with the personality of the individual and how people feel about that individual. He obviously has a very strong core group of supporters, but I think outside of that supporters, he's one of these people that nobody's neutral on, right? Whether right, left, or in between, folks either are ardent supporters or they are increasingly becoming oppositional, and that's just as true on the right as it is the left.
Although, in our state, and that's true, I think nationally, in our state, though, which had the highest percentage vote for Trump, us in Indiana, we're always fighting that out for who was going to be top on that. But, we had 20 new state legislators here. We've got a whole group of new red. So, and this is has been a strong Trump state. So just his aura doesn't necessarily make it a negative. But where he got really engaged, and I think, like you said, it became more about him. That wasn't the case here, but it was in some places, and I think it did. I think it did matter, and not always to the positive of the candidate. So.
But there were a few candidates that performed well that were very, very. Trump was very, but J.D. Vance is a great example of that. I mean,
but even there, Mike DeWine, who's in Ohio, he won by he had a much stronger showing. And I think if I'm going from memory here, but but even there, Vance should have probably done better even there than what he did.
Yeah.
So will the Republican Party survive the Trump-DeSantis civil war that's upon us? Are we gonna make it through this?
I think I know people talk about civil war, but
well, it's not even a civil war. I think they're on the same side policy-wise.
But I
civil
think
war is really establishment versus the.
I think you're going to have. I don't think it's all going to be bad come out of this. I think people are going to. They're going to look at and really think about what they're doing and think about what's being said. And I mean, when Trump was president, we certainly didn't have gas prices this high. Our economy was not in the tank. Other nations, I think, respected us more. But there's been a lot happened since he was in office with him that, like to your point, has maybe I think the voters are going to decide the future of Donald Trump. That's for sure. They're going to decide. There's going to be a decision made there.
The interesting thing about this sort of proposition of a civil war within the Republican Party that is so interesting is the message of the Tea Party in 2012 was that the establishment is not conservative enough. Right? That was sort of the central message. There were a couple of specific issues around Obamacare and debt and those kinds of things, but the central message was we want the establishment to be more conservative.
And to fight more. Yeah.
That's not really the message right now. The message is not so much an ideological or a policy message. It's a combination of personality, of vision for how we ought to sort of interact with one another on a foundational basis. And in terms of Trump DeSantis in particular, there's some policy disagreement, but not a tremendous amount. Certainly not the way there was between sort of Tea Party candidates and establishment candidates in 2010, right? And so the question is really who has the leadership style that Republicans are more interested in, right?
Yeah. That can appeal to the
That
middle.
is exactly right. The style. This is more about style than it is substance.
Yeah.
It really is. And it's going to be really interesting. I think this is going to be one of the most interesting. We thought the last Republican presidential primary when Donald Trump first ran and of course Senator Paul had announced but Trump took all the oxygen out of that race. But I think we're going to see a different dynamic this time. I think it's going to be a really interesting primary. I think.
But if the energy can get behind another Trump candidacy that we saw in 2016 or even 2020, I mean he had more votes in 2020. If you can get that type of energy in this 2024 election, I think I don't know. We'll see. It's a tough call. I'm definitely open to other ideas but I do think the Republican Party needs a real change. I think and it's happening organically. There's a realignment going on in both parties, and it's not. And this whole populist versus establishment, dynamic is just that's the result of that, and so we just have to let that play out and see where it goes. And I think you're going to see coalitions develop in the next few years that you're going to really question where did this come from. For example, you might see a lot of unions voting Republican now. Well, you might see a lot of businesses going hard. Well, I mean, look at Silicon Valley. Are they
going woke?
That's big. That's big business. Big business used to be
Yeah.
in the Republican Party. Well, it's now the
Well, we're already seeing that even in the state level in some respects.
That's right.
That it's big business that's dominating, for example, the chambers
That's right.
agenda. Not all of it, some of it, but they're having. My point is they're having a lot of influence in there,
and they may line up more with the left as opposed to the right.
If Republicans can competently put together a multiracial working class coalition, then they'll start to win elections that they shouldn't, right? Or that you wouldn't think that they would.
Right.
If you look at Cori Bush's district, which is the city of St. Louis and some of the northern parts of St. Louis County like Ferguson, her Republican challenger did multiples of points better this election cycle than in 2018. Those are urban black voters who chose to pull the lever for a Republican in a way that she'll control that district for as long as she wants, right? That it's very unlikely that they'll become a majority there.
We need a bigger tent. The Republicans.
But if those
need a bigger
voters
tent.
are voting for Republicans statewide, all of a sudden you have really serious Republican margins statewide.
Yeah. Exactly. And then the question is that type of voter more likely to vote for a Mitt Romney or a Donald Trump? And that's what I think Donald Trump has proven to the world in the past few years.
Or a Ron DeSantis, who style-wise is more palatable to a moderate, but substantive. You listen, he's very conservative.
That's right.
Yeah. And I think that's the answer, right? And I think that's what we saw on election night more than anything else. This was not a rejection of conservatism to the point that people want the sort of squishy moderate. This was not an embrace of sort of Trumpian tactics. What the response from especially Republican voters and Republican-leaning independents were, we want you to be conservative, we want you to fight, but we want you to be polite and respectful and govern in a way.
I think that we'll leave that for another show because I think people still want to fight her.
The genius of Trump is that he's actually caused that to happen, that you can actually be a polite or moderate candidate, be very conservative, and win.
Right.
That's true. I mean, that's true.
So moderate in disposition, conservative in policy.
Yeah.
Right.
Sort of like you, Tom.
Yeah, exactly right. Well, we're out of time on this segment. I wanted to get to the governor's race, but we'll save that for the next show. So, okay, well, we just went through a very interesting midterm, and we're still trying to learn the lessons from that. But go ahead,
and
Jim.
BIPS, I need to say, I'm with the Bluegrass Institute. We're at BIPS.org, so please check us out online.
Exactly right. Great.
And my weekly column in newspapers around the state.
Absolutely. And yours,
we are foropportunity.org.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
great
Josh,
organization. Great.
Well, Josh and Jim, thanks for being on the show tonight and unpacking this election. So you're watching the station. We'll see you next week. And just God bless America.